Thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Abigail Ross trudged through the rain-soaked mud, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping the tattered shawl that offered little protection against the relentless downpour. Her sodden dress, once a cheerful blue calico, now clung to her trembling form like a second skin as lightning illuminated the desolate landscape of 1875 Breckenridge. She had been walking for hours. Perhaps days' time had become a blur since she'd fled, her only thought to get as far away as possible from the life she'd left behind. Daniel Keller squinted through the driving rain from beneath the brim of his weather-beaten Stetson, the reins of his dapple-gray mare gripped tightly in his calloused hands. He'd been on his way back to his homestead after a long day of mending fences when the storm hit. At first, he thought the figure stumbling along the muddy road was a mirage, a trick of the fading light and the curtains of rain. But as he drew closer, the shape became unmistakable, a woman, heavy with child, alone in this God-forsaken storm. "Whoa, girl," he murmured to his horse, pulling back gently on the reins. The mare snorted, tossing her head against the rein as Daniel dismounted in one fluid motion, his worn leather boots sinking into the mud. "Madam," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Madam, are you all right?" Abigail startled at the sound of his voice, her eyes wide with fear as she stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing on the slick ground. "Stay back," she warned, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I don't need any help." Daniel raised his hands in a placating gesture, keeping his distance. "Madam, you're in no condition to be out in this weather. My ranch is just over that ridge. You'll have shelter and rest there if you'll allow me to help you." A particularly violent gust of wind nearly knocked Abigail off her feet. She staggered, and Daniel moved forward instinctively, catching her elbow to steady her. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away, too exhausted to resist. "I don't know you," she said, her teeth chattering. "Daniel Keller, madam. I run the Double K Ranch about 2 miles from here." He gestured toward the distant hills. "I give you my word as a gentleman, I mean you no harm, just offering shelter from this storm." Abigail assessed him with wary eyes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind beneath the shadow of his hat brim. The baby kicked hard within her, as if offering its own opinion on the matter. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Abigail's resolve crumbled along with her strength. "All right," she conceded, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Just for tonight." Daniel nodded, relief washing over his features. "My horse can carry us both. Can you manage to climb up with my help?" It took some awkward maneuvering, but soon Abigail was seated in the saddle with Daniel mounted behind her, one arm respectfully around her waist to keep her secure. The warmth of his chest against her back was the first comfort she'd felt in days. "I'm Daniel Keller," he repeated, realizing she hadn't offered her name in return. There was a long pause before she answered, Abigail Ross." "Well, Miss Ross, let's get you somewhere dry." The journey to the ranch seemed endless, with rain pelting them mercilessly and the wind howling through the trees like lost souls. By the time the outline of Daniel's cabin came into view, Abigail was barely conscious, slumped against his chest, her hands clutching the pommel of the saddle with what little strength remained. Daniel's homestead was modest but well tended. A sturdy log cabin stood beside a small barn, both structures weathering the storm with stoic resilience. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, dissipating quickly in the rain, evidence that the fire he'd banked that morning was still smoldering. He guided his mare to the barn first, dismounting swiftly before reaching up to help Abigail down. Her legs buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Daniel caught her in his arms, lifting her as gently as possible. "Easy now," he murmured. "We're safe here." The interior of the cabin was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rocking chair pulled close to the hearth. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood in what served as the kitchen area, while a curtain partially concealed a bed in the corner. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but maintained his surroundings with care. Daniel carried Abigail to the rocking chair, setting her down carefully before hurrying to stoke the fire. Soon, flames were dancing merrily in the grate, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Daniel said matter-of-factly, moving to a chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a clean flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks. "These will be too big, but they're dry. I'll step outside while you change." Abigail clutched the offered garments, still shivering violently. "Thank you," she managed, the words catching in her throat. True to his word, Daniel went back out into the storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Abigail struggled out of her sodden dress, her fingers clumsy with cold. The flannel shirt was indeed enormous on her frame, reaching nearly to her knees, but it was blissfully dry and smelled of soap and pine. The wool socks enveloped her frozen feet in blessed warmth. A discreet knock sounded at the door. "Are you decent, Miss Ross?" "Yes," she called back, sinking into the rocking chair again. Daniel entered, water streaming from his hat and coat. He hung both on pegs by the door before moving to the kitchen area, where he set a kettle on the cast iron stove. "I'll make some tea," he said, keeping his voice conversational, as if finding pregnant women in rainstorms was an everyday occurrence. "And I've got some stew I can heat up. When's the last time you ate?" Abigail tried to remember. "Yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before." Daniel's brow furrowed with concern, but he said nothing, busying himself with preparations for their meal. Soon, the cabin was filled with the comforting aroma of beef stew, and Abigail felt her stomach clench with hunger. When he placed a steaming bowl in front of her, along with a thick slice of bread, she couldn't help but fall upon the food with desperate gratitude. Daniel sat across from her with his own bowl, his eyes tactfully averted to give her a measure of privacy as she ate. Only when she'd scraped her bowl clean did he speak again. "The storm's not likely to let up before morning. You're welcome to take the bed. I'll make do out here by the fire." Abigail set her spoon down, finally meeting his gaze directly. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Keller?" "You don't know anything about me." Daniel considered her question, his blue eyes thoughtful. "My ma raised me to believe that the measure of a man is how he treats those who need help. She'd have my hide if I left a woman, especially one in your condition, out in a storm like this." He paused, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Besides, out here we look after each other. It's the way of things." There was a simplicity to his answer that made Abigail's throat tighten with emotion. It had been so long since anyone had shown her basic kindness without expecting something in return. "Thank you," she said again, the words inadequate but sincere. Daniel nodded, accepting her gratitude without fanfare. "Now, if you don't mind my asking, what brings you out to these parts, Miss Ross?" "Breckenridge isn't exactly on the main thoroughfare, and we don't see many travelers this time of year, especially not," he hesitated, gesturing vaguely toward her pregnant belly. Abigail's hands instinctively moved to cradle her unborn child. "I'm heading to Helena," she said, the lie coming easily after weeks of practice. "My sister lives there. She's expecting me." If Daniel noticed the evasion in her eyes, he gave no indication. "Helena's still a good 80 miles north of here," he remarked. "That's quite a journey in your condition." "I was on the stagecoach," Abigail elaborated, weaving truth with falsehood, "but there was trouble with the wheel and they had to stop for repairs in a town back east a ways. They said it would take days and I couldn't wait." She lowered her eyes, hoping he wouldn't press further. Daniel seemed to sense her reluctance to share more. "Well, the important thing is you're safe now. We can figure out the rest in the morning." Relief washed over Abigail. "Yes," she agreed softly. In the morning. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, rain lashing against the windows and wind moaning through the eaves. Inside, the fire crackled reassuringly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Abigail allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. Daniel busied himself with clearing away their dishes and preparing the bed for his guest. He added extra blankets and plumped the pillow with awkward care that suggested he wasn't used to accommodating visitors. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's clean and warm." Abigail eyed the bed longingly, exhaustion pulling at every fiber of her being. "It looks wonderful, Mr. Keller." "Daniel," he corrected gently. "No need for formalities out here." A small smile touched her lips. "Daniel, then." As she settled into the bed, drawing the quilts up around her chin, Abigail watched Daniel arrange a makeshift pallet near the fireplace. His movements were efficient, those of a man accustomed to making do with what was available. There was something comforting about his presence, solid and unpretentious. Sleep claimed her almost immediately, dragging her into a darkness deeper than the storm-shrouded night outside. For the first time in weeks, she didn't dream of the past she was running from. Instead, her sleep was empty and restful, the kind that comes only with absolute exhaustion and a fragile sense of security. When Abigail awoke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world of vibrant colors. She blinked, momentarily disoriented by her surroundings until memory returned. Daniel was already up, his pallet neatly rolled and stowed away. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the cabin, making Abigail's stomach growl audibly. She sat up, wincing at the various aches that reminded her of yesterday's ordeal. "Good morning," Daniel greeted her from his position at the stove. "Thought I'd let you sleep. You looked like you needed it." Abigail pushed a strand of tangled hair behind her ear, suddenly conscious of her appearance. "What time is it?" "Just past 8, he replied, sliding a spatula under a piece of bacon. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she admitted. "Thank you for everything." Daniel nodded, his expression warm but respectful. "Hungry. Breakfast is almost ready." The meal was simple but hearty: bacon, eggs, and biscuits still warm from the oven. Abigail ate with genuine appreciation, savoring each bite. Daniel was a surprisingly good cook for a man living alone on the frontier. "Do you always prepare such feasts for breakfast?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Daniel chuckled, the sound pleasant and unaffected. "No, madam. Usually it's just coffee and whatever's left from the night before, but I figured you needed something substantial." He hesitated before adding, "Eating for 2 and all." Abigail's hand moved automatically to her belly. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose I am." A question hung unspoken in the air between them, but Daniel didn't voice it. Instead, he rose to pour more coffee into her cup. "I've been thinking," he said, returning to his seat. "Helena's a fair distance, as I mentioned last night. The next stagecoach won't come through Breckenridge for another week or so." He met her gaze steadily. "You're welcome to stay here until then, or," he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, "or until you figure out what you really want to do." Abigail tensed, her cup halfway to her lips. "What do you mean by that?" Daniel's expression remained open, without judgment. "Just that I've been around long enough to recognize when someone's running from something, or someone." He held up a hand as she began to protest. "I'm not asking you to explain. Your business is your own. I'm just offering a safe place to rest for as long as you need it." Tears pricked at the corners of Abigail's eyes, much to her dismay. She blinked them back, determined not to cry in front of this man who had already shown her more kindness than she deserved. "I don't want to impose," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's no imposition," Daniel assured her. "Truth be told, it's nice having someone to share a meal with. Gets lonely out here sometimes." Abigail studied him, trying to discern his motives. Daniel Keller was unlike any man she had ever met. There was no artifice about him, no hidden agenda she could detect. He was offering help simply because he could, with no expectation of anything in return. "All right," she agreed finally. "Just until the stagecoach comes." Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Good, that's settled then." He rose from the table, collecting their empty plates. "Now I've got chores to attend to, but you should rest. Doctor's orders." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Are you a doctor, Mr. Keller?" His smile turned sheepish. "No, but I've delivered my fair share of foals and calves, and please, it's Daniel." Despite herself, Abigail laughed, a small, rusty sound that surprised her. It had been so long since anything had seemed remotely amusing. Daniel headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Make yourself at home, Abigail. What's mine is yours while you're here." After he left, Abigail sat for a long time at the table, cradling her coffee cup between her hands. The situation was surreal, finding herself in the home of a stranger who had taken her in without question. Part of her, The part that had learned harsh lessons about trust whispered caution. But a deeper instinct told her that Daniel Keller was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man offering help to someone in need. For the first time in months, Abigail allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, her luck had finally changed. The days that followed settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Daniel rose early each morning to tend to his livestock, a small herd of cattle, 2 horses, and a few chickens that provided fresh eggs. Abigail, despite his protests that she should rest, insisted on contributing to the household. She took over the cooking, using the simple provisions in Daniel's pantry to create meals that he declared were far superior to his own efforts. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked one evening as they shared a rabbit stew that Abigail had seasoned with herbs she'd found growing near the cabin. Abigail stirred her spoon through the rich broth. "My mother taught me. She believed a woman should know how to make a proper home." A shadow crossed her face. "Though I'm not sure she'd approve of how I've applied those lessons." Daniel seemed to sense the pain beneath her words. "I think she'd be proud of how you've managed, given the circumstances." Abigail didn't respond, but his words settled something within her, a small measure of peace amidst the turmoil of her thoughts. As the days passed, Daniel made no further attempts to pry into her past, and Abigail found herself gradually relaxing in his presence. They worked companionably during the day, Daniel with his ranch chores, Abigail keeping the cabin in order and tending to the small kitchen garden that provided fresh vegetables. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Daniel proved to be surprisingly well-read for a frontier rancher. A small bookshelf in the corner of the cabin held volumes of poetry, history, and even a few novels. "My father believed in the value of education," Daniel explained when he caught Abigail examining his collection. "He taught me to read before I could even sit a horse properly." "He sounds like a wise man." Daniel's expression grew distant. "He died of pneumonia when I was 15. Ma followed 2 years later." He ran his fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume. "These books are what I have left of them." Abigail's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry," Daniel shrugged, the gesture not dismissive but accepting. "It's the way of things out here. Life is hard, but it goes on." He selected a book and held it out to her. "Have you read Emerson?" The conversation shifted to literature, and Abigail was grateful for the reprieve from more personal topics. She found herself enjoying these quiet evenings more than she cared to admit. Daniel was easy to talk to, his observations thoughtful without being pretentious. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Abigail was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when a sharp pain gripped her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the wooden support post as the sensation intensified, then gradually subsided. "Just a false alarm," she murmured to herself, rubbing her belly soothingly. "Still a few weeks to go, little one." But as the day progressed, the pains returned with increasing frequency. By the time Daniel came in from the fields, Abigail was pacing the cabin floor, one hand pressed against her lower back, her face pale with discomfort. "Abigail," Daniel's voice was sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" She tried to smile reassuringly but winced as another contraction seized her. "I think the baby might be coming a bit earlier than expected." Daniel's eyes widened with alarm. "Now, but I thought," he broke off, running a hand through his hair. "The doctor's in town a good 10 miles from here." "There's no time," Abigail said, gritting her teeth against the pain. "This baby isn't waiting for anyone." The reality of the situation settled over them both. Daniel took a deep breath, visibly gathering his composure. "All right, I've helped birth plenty of animals, can't be that different, right?" Despite her discomfort, Abigail almost laughed at his forced optimism. "I hope you're right, Daniel." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and focused effort. Daniel proved remarkably calm under pressure, fetching water, clean linens, and following Abigail's instructions with unwavering attention. When the pains became unbearable, he held her hand, allowing her to crush his fingers without complaint. "You're doing fine," he reassured her repeatedly. "Just fine." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Abigail's labor intensified. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and she bit back cries of pain, determined not to scream. "I can see the head," Daniel announced, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "One more push, Abigail, one more." Gathering the last reserves of her strength, Abigail bore down, a primal sound tearing from her throat. There was a moment of searing pain, followed by an indescribable release of pressure. Then, piercing the evening quiet, came the thin, angry cry of a newborn. "It's a boy," Daniel said, wonder evident in his voice. "A perfect little boy." Tears streamed down Abigail's face as Daniel placed the squalling infant on her chest. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, his tiny fists balled in outrage at the indignity of birth, but to Abigail, he was the most beautiful sight she had ever beheld. "Hello, little one," she whispered, running a trembling finger along his cheek. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel busied himself with the necessary tasks, cutting the cord, delivering the afterbirth, and cleaning up as best he could. When all was settled, he sat beside the bed, watching mother and child with a mixture of awe and something else Abigail couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Daniel shook his head, dismissing her gratitude. "You did all the hard work. I was just here to catch him." The baby had quieted, nestling against his mother's warmth. His tiny hand had wrapped around her finger with surprising strength. "Have you thought about a name?" Daniel asked softly. Abigail gazed down at her son. She had considered many names during her pregnancy, but now, looking at this new life that had entered the world under such unusual circumstances, only one seemed fitting. "Joshua," she decided. "It means God is salvation." She met Daniel's eyes. "Because I think he must have sent you to save us both." A flush crept up Daniel's neck, but he held her gaze. "I'm honored, Abigail. It's a fine name for a fine boy." As night settled fully over the ranch, Abigail drifted into an exhausted sleep, her son cradled securely in the crook of her arm. Daniel remained vigilant, checking on them periodically, marveling at the miracle that had unfolded in his humble cabin. Looking at Abigail's peaceful face in repose, he felt something shift within him, a recognition that his life had changed irrevocably with the arrival of this woman and her child. What that change meant, he wasn't yet sure, but as he settled into the rocking chair to keep watch through the night, Daniel knew he would do whatever was necessary to protect them both. The days following Joshua's birth brought a new rhythm to life at the Double K Ranch. Daniel, showing unexpected aptitude, fashioned a cradle from a wooden crate lined with soft blankets. He placed it near Abigail's bed, where she could easily reach out to comfort the infant when he fussed during the night. Abigail recovered quickly from the birth, her youth and inherent strength serving her well. By the third day, she was insisting on resuming some of her household duties, though Daniel tried to persuade her to rest longer. "I'm fine, truly," she assured him, moving carefully around the kitchen as she prepared their breakfast. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. It's not an illness." Daniel watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Maybe not, but most women have other women around to help. You shouldn't be doing all this alone." A shadow crossed Abigail's face. "I've been alone for longer than you know. This is nothing new." The statement hung between them, an inadvertent revelation that Abigail immediately seemed to regret. She turned away, busying herself with the stove. Daniel hesitated, then said quietly, "You're not alone now, Abigail." She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension easing from her posture. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Joshua sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle, Daniel broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "The stagecoach comes through tomorrow," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "To Breckenridge." Abigail's hands stilled in her lap. "Yes, I suppose it does. Do you still plan to go to Helena?" The question was gentle, without pressure. She was silent for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "There is no sister in Helena," she admitted finally. "That was a lie." Daniel nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much. You're not angry?" Abigail looked up, searching his face. "No." His answer was simple and honest. "We all have reasons for the things we do. I reckon you had good reason for your lie." Encouraged by his understanding, Abigail found herself wanting to explain, to unburden herself of the secrets she'd been carrying. "I was married," she began, the words coming slowly at first, then gathering momentum. "His name was Thomas. He was charming and handsome, and I thought myself in love. We married quickly, too quickly, as my father warned." She twisted her hands together, reliving painful memories. "It wasn't long before I saw the real Thomas. He had a terrible temper, especially when he drank, and he drank often." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "When I discovered I was with child, I thought things would improve. They didn't. If anything, Thomas became more volatile. She faltered, then forced herself to continue. "He struck me more than once. The last time I feared for the baby, so I took what little money I had saved and ran." Daniel's eyes, normally so gentle, had hardened with anger. "Did he try to find you?" Abigail shook her head. "I don't think so. Thomas cared more for his pride than for me or the child. But I was afraid to stay anywhere too long, just in case." She glanced at the sleeping infant. "Joshua isn't premature. I was further along than I let on. I've been running for nearly 3 months." The admission hung in the air between them. Daniel rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm and reassuring. "Abigail, listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You don't have to run anymore. You and Joshua can stay here for as long as you want. I promise you'll be safe." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "Why would you do that? You hardly know me." Daniel's expression softened. "I know enough. I know you're brave and strong. I know you're a good mother who'd do anything to protect her child." He paused, seemed to gather his courage. "And I know that, in the short time you've been here, I've come to care for you both more than I thought possible." The confession startled Abigail. She had been so focused on survival, on the immediate needs of herself and her child, that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge the growing connection between herself and this quiet, steadfast man. "Daniel, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm just offering you a home for as long as you want it." A weight Abigail hadn't even realized she was carrying seemed to lift from her shoulders. The prospect of safety, of stability, was almost too much to hope for. But looking into Daniel's earnest face, she found herself believing it might be possible. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hands. "We'd like to stay, for a while at least." Relief washed over Daniel's features, followed by a smile that transformed his entire countenance. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." Joshua chose that moment to stir, his tiny face scrunching up as he began to fuss. Abigail moved to pick him up, cradling him against her shoulder. "Someone's hungry," she murmured, rocking gently. Daniel stood, tactfully giving her privacy. "I'll check on the livestock before turning in," he said, reaching for his coat. At the door, he paused, looking back at the tableau of mother and child illuminated by the firelight. His expression was one of quiet contentment, as if witnessing something precious beyond words. After he left, Abigail settled into the rocking chair to nurse her son. The cabin felt different, somehow no longer just a temporary shelter, but something that might, in time, become a home. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had trusted before and been betrayed. Could she risk her heart again? Looking down at Joshua's peaceful face as he nursed, Abigail realized the decision might not be entirely hers to make. Her heart, it seemed, had already begun to heal and open in ways she hadn't anticipated. Spring gave way to summer, and life at the Double K Ranch fell into a comfortable pattern. Daniel worked from sunrise to sunset, tending to his cattle and the modest crops he grew to supplement his income. Abigail managed the household with increasing confidence, adding feminine touches to the cabin that transformed it from a bachelor's dwelling to a proper home. Joshua thrived under their care, growing from a newborn into an alert, chubby-cheeked infant who delighted in exploring his surroundings. He had his mother's dark hair, and to Abigail's secret relief, showed no resemblance to Thomas. Instead, there was something in the set of his jaw and the directness of his gaze that reminded her of Daniel, a resemblance born not of blood, but of constant, loving presence. Daniel doted on the boy. spending his evenings entertaining Joshua with improvised toys and gentle roughhousing that invariably ended with the baby's delighted giggles. Watching them together, Abigail often felt a sweet ache in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that she wasn't yet ready to name. "He's going to be as tall as you someday," she remarked one evening as Daniel sat on the cabin floor, helping Joshua practice standing on his wobbly legs. Daniel glanced up, his expression warm. "Got your stubborn streak, though, won't give up until he gets what he wants." Abigail laughed. "I prefer to call it determination." "That's a fancier word for the same thing," Daniel teased, steadying Joshua as the baby bounced excitedly. These quiet moments of domesticity had become precious to Abigail. She found herself looking forward to the evenings when the three of them were together, Daniel regaling her with stories of his day, or reading aloud from one of his books while she mended clothes, or worked on the quilt she was making for Joshua's first winter. It was during one such evening, as summer waned and the first hints of autumn tinged the air, that their peaceful existence was disrupted. They had just finished supper when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Visitors were rare at the Double K, especially as daylight faded. Daniel rose from his chair, his expression cautious. "Stay inside," he instructed, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door. Abigail gathered Joshua close, anxiety tightening her chest as Daniel stepped outside to meet whoever had arrived. Through the window, she could see him standing on the porch, rifle held loosely but ready as two riders approached. The conversation was brief and too distant for Abigail to hear. When Daniel returned, his face was grave. "Trouble?" Abigail asked, her arms still protectively around Joshua. Daniel set the rifle aside. "Not exactly. That was Ted Simmons and his boy from the next property over. They were in Breckenridge today and heard something I think you should know about." Abigail's heart began to race. "What is it?" Daniel sat down beside her, his manner gentle but serious. "There's a man in town asking questions about a woman with a baby. Dark-haired pretty, said she's his wife and ran off while he was away on business." He paused, watching her face carefully. "Sound like anyone you know?" All the color drained from Abigail's cheeks. "Thomas," she whispered. "He's found me." "We don't know that for certain," Daniel cautioned. "Could be coincidence." But Abigail was already shaking her head, panic rising within her. "It's him, I know it is. He must have tracked me somehow." She stood abruptly, clutching Joshua to her chest. "We have to go tonight." Daniel rose as well, placing steadying hands on her shoulders. "Abigail, wait, think about this. It's nearly dark and you've got Joshua to consider. Running off half-cocked isn't the answer." "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice trembling. "If Thomas finds us, he won't," Daniel assured her firmly. "Not tonight, at least. According to Ted, this fellow's staying at the hotel in town. He's been drinking heavily and shooting his mouth off, but he hasn't made any move to start searching the outlying ranches." His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly, grounding her. "We have time to think, to make a plan." Abigail wanted to argue, but the solid presence of Daniel's hands and the sleeping weight of Joshua in her arms helped calm the initial surge of panic. "What kind of plan?" she asked finally. Daniel's expression turned contemplative. "First, we need to be sure it's really him. I'll ride into town tomorrow, see this man for myself." "No," Abigail protested. "He might recognize you or follow you back here." "He's never seen me before," Daniel pointed out reasonably. "And I know how to make sure I'm not followed. I've been tracking cattle rustlers since I was 16. Abigail bit her lip, unconvinced. "And if it is Thomas, what then?" Daniel's eyes hardened. "Then we deal with him. Legally," he added, seeing her expression. "Montana territory has laws against abandonment and abuse. If he's truly looking for you, he's not hiding his identity. That means he believes he has the law on his side, a husband's right to his wife and child." "He does," Abigail said bitterly. "In the eyes of the law, I belong to him, just like his horse or his watch." "Not out here," Daniel countered. "Things work differently on the frontier. Community counts for more than some paper from back east." He guided her back to her chair, encouraging her to sit. "Besides, we don't even know if it's him yet. Let's not borrow trouble." Abigail allowed herself to be seated, the initial surge of fear receding enough for rational thought to return. All right, she conceded. You'll go to town tomorrow, but promise me you'll be careful. Daniel's smile was reassuring. Always am. He knelt beside her chair, his gaze serious. Abigail, I need you to know something. No matter what happens, I won't let anyone take you or Joshua away against your will, not ever. The vehemence in his voice startled her. Daniel, I mean it, he insisted. These past months, having you and Joshua here, he faltered, seemingly at a loss for words. This is your home now, both of you, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way. The declaration hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Abigail found herself unable to respond, her throat tight with feelings she had been carefully avoiding for months. Daniel seemed to understand her silence. He rose, squeezing her shoulder gently. Get some rest. Things always look clearer in the morning, but rest eluded Abigail that night. She lay awake long after Daniel had settled onto his pallet by the fire, an arrangement he had insisted on maintaining despite her offers to find a more permanent solution. Listening to Joshua's soft breathing and imagining Thomas's angry face looming out of the darkness. The past she had fled had finally caught up with her, threatening the tentative happiness she had found. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Abigail made a decision. She would not run again, not without knowing for certain what they were facing. But neither would she stand idly by while others determined her fate. When Daniel rose to begin his morning chores, he found Abigail already up, dressed in her sturdiest gown, her hair neatly pinned beneath a bonnet. I'm coming with you to town, she announced without preamble. Daniel paused in the act of pulling on his boots. Abigail, I don't think I need to see him for myself, she interrupted. I need to know if it's really Thomas. And if it is, Daniel asked, his voice gentle but probing. What then? Abigail lifted her chin. Then I'll face him. On my terms, not his. Daniel studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined expression and the steel in her spine. Finally, he nodded. All right, but we do this carefully. Joshua stays here with Mrs. Simmons. I'll arrange it when I feed the stock. Abigail hesitated, reluctant to be separated from her son. Is that safe? Safer than taking him to town, Daniel pointed out. Mrs. Simmons raised 6 children of her own. Joshua will be fine for a few hours. The logic was sound, though it did little to ease the anxiety that clutched at Abigail's heart. Very well, she agreed reluctantly. They set out mid-morning after delivering Joshua to the capable hands of Mrs. Simmons, a motherly woman who shooed away Abigail's detailed instructions with good-natured understanding. The ride to Breckenridge was tense, with Abigail perched behind Daniel on his mare, her arms around his waist and her thoughts racing ahead to the confrontation that might await. The town of Breckenridge was modest by any standard, a single street lined with wooden buildings, most of them weathered to a silvery gray by Montana's harsh climate. A general store, a smithy, a small church, and the 2-story hotel that served as the community's social hub made up the heart of the settlement. Daniel guided his horse to the livery stable at the far end of town, deliberately avoiding the busy area near the hotel. We'll approach on foot, he explained as he helped Abigail dismount, less noticeable that way. As they walked up the dusty main street, Abigail kept her head down, grateful for the concealing brim of her bonnet. Daniel, by contrast, moved with casual confidence, nodding to acquaintances but not stopping to chat. His hand rested lightly at the small of Abigail's back, a gesture both protective and grounding. The hotel's front porch offered a clear view of the saloon across the street, where, according to Ted Simmons, the stranger had been spending most of his time. Daniel led Abigail to a bench partially screened by an overgrown bush, positioning himself beside her so that she could observe without being easily seen. They didn't have long to wait. Within half an hour, the saloon doors swung open and a man emerged, pausing to light a cigar on the steps. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Ross stood barely 20 yards away, looking much as he had when she'd left him, handsome in a flashy way, with his dark hair slicked back and his mustache neatly trimmed. He wore an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the frontier town, and a gold watch chain glinted across his vest. Only someone who knew him well would notice the slight unsteadiness in his stance that betrayed his early morning drinking. "Is that him?" Daniel asked quietly, though he could read the answer in her rigid posture. "Yes," Abigail whispered. "That's Thomas." Daniel's expression hardened as he studied the man who had caused Abigail so much pain. "He doesn't look like much," he observed with deceptive mildness. "He's stronger than he appears," Abigail warned, "and when he's in a rage." She left the sentence unfinished, but Daniel understood. His jaw tightened perceptibly, and Abigail could feel the tension radiating from him. Thomas finished his cigar and flicked it into the street before turning back toward the saloon. As he reached for the door, he paused, his attention caught by something or someone across the way. To Abigail's horror, he turned slowly, his gaze scanning the hotel porch. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he had spotted her, but Thomas's eyes passed over their partially concealed bench without recognition, and he continued into the saloon. "He didn't see us," Daniel assured her, feeling her tremble beside him, "but we should go, no sense pushing our luck." Abigail nodded, eager to put distance between herself and Thomas. They rose, Daniel subtly positioning himself to block her from view as they descended the steps and headed back toward the livery. They had nearly reached the end of the street when a familiar voice called out from behind them. "Abigail, Abigail Ross, is that you?" Abigail froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she turned to face her husband. Thomas stood several yards away, his expression a mixture of triumph and anger. "I knew it," he declared loudly, drawing the attention of passers-by. "I knew you'd turn up eventually." Daniel moved closer to Abigail, his presence solid and reassuring. "Keep walking," he murmured. "We can make it to the horses." But Thomas was already striding toward them, his earlier unsteadiness masked by determination. "Where's my son, Abigail?" he demanded. "Where's my boy?" Abigail found her voice, surprising herself with its steadiness. "He's safe, Thomas, safe from you." Thomas's face darkened. "He's my flesh and blood, and you had no right to take him." He stopped a few feet away, finally seeming to register Daniel's presence. "Who's this?" "Your latest conquest, Mr. Ross," Daniel said evenly, stepping slightly forward. "My name is Daniel Keller. Your wife and son have been staying at my ranch while recovering from an unfortunate situation." Thomas sneered. "Is that what she told you?" "Some sob story about her unfortunate situation." He turned his attention back to Abigail. "Did you tell him how you abandoned your husband without a word, how you stole my money and ran off while I was away on business?" "Business?" Abigail echoed incredulously. "Is that what you call gambling and drinking away every cent we had?" Her fear was giving way to anger, years of suppressed resentment breaking free. "Did you tell anyone about the bruises you left, about how you threw me down the stairs when I asked for money to buy food?" Thomas's expression turned ugly. "You always were prone to exaggeration, my dear." "I don't think she's exaggerating at all," Daniel interjected, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I think you should leave now, Mr. Ross. Go back east. There's nothing for you here." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Nothing except my wife and child, and I'll be taking them both home with me." He reached for Abigail's arm. Daniel moved with surprising speed for a man his size, inserting himself between them. "That's not happening." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Abigail recognized Sheriff Miller, a taciturn man with a reputation for fairness. He approached slowly, hand resting on his gun belt. "Problem here, folks?" he inquired, his gaze taking in the tableau Thomas with his hand outstretched, Daniel standing protectively before Abigail. "No problem at all, Sheriff," Thomas replied smoothly, lowering his hand. "Just a family reunion. This is my wife, Abigail. She's been unwell. I've come to take her home where she belongs." Sheriff Miller turned to Abigail. "That true, madam? This your husband?" Abigail straightened her spine, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "He is, by law, but I left him for good reason, Sheriff. He was unkind." The euphemism felt inadequate, but she was conscious of the watching crowd. The sheriff's weathered face revealed nothing. "I see, and the child I've heard about, my son," Thomas interjected before Abigail could respond. "My son, whom she took from me without consent." "Joshua is my son too," Abigail countered, "and I took him to protect him." Sheriff Miller sighed, clearly recognizing the complexity of the situation. Look, folks, domestic matters aren't usually my jurisdiction, but I can't have a public disturbance in my town. He gestured toward the jailhouse down the street. Why don't we continue this conversation in my office? More private that way. Thomas nodded, arranging his features into an expression of reasonable concern. Of course, Sheriff, whatever you think best. Daniel exchanged a glance with Abigail, who nodded slightly. After you, Mr. Ross, he said, his tone making the courtesy sound like a challenge. The walk to the sheriff's office was tense, with Thomas striding ahead alongside Sheriff Miller, occasionally glancing back at Abigail with a look that made her skin crawl. Daniel stayed close beside her, his presence a bulwark against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. It will be all right, he murmured as they approached the jailhouse. I won't let him take you. Abigail wished she could share his confidence, but the law was clear on a husband's rights. Thomas had every legal claim to both her and Joshua, regardless of his treatment of them. Her only hope lay in Sheriff Miller's willingness to look beyond the letter of the law to its spirit. The sheriff's office was sparsely furnished but scrupulously neat. A desk dominated the small space, with chairs arranged before it and a pot-bellied stove in the corner that would provide warmth in the winter months. Miller gestured for them all to sit, then took his place behind the desk. Now, he began, folding his hands on the desk's surface, let's get to the bottom of this. Mr. Ross, you claim Mrs. Ross left without your knowledge or consent, taking your child with her. Thomas nodded emphatically. That's right, Sheriff. I returned from a business trip to find my home empty, my wife and newborn son gone, along with a considerable sum of money from my personal safe. He leaned forward earnestly. I've been searching for them ever since, worried sick about their welfare. And you, Mrs. Ross. Miller turned his attention to Abigail. Why did you leave? Abigail took a steadying breath. Because I feared for our lives, Sheriff Thomas. Mr. Ross has a violent temper, especially when he drinks, which is often. She hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. He struck me multiple times during our marriage. The last time I was 7 months with child, I feared what might happen to the baby if I stayed. Thomas scoffed. Ridiculous. I may have raised my voice on occasion, what husband doesn't, but I never laid a hand on her. She has a scar, Daniel said quietly, above her right temple, still visible if you look closely. All eyes turned to Abigail, who reluctantly pushed back a strand of hair to reveal a thin, pale line that disappeared into her hairline. A household accident, Thomas dismissed with a wave of his hand. She fell while cleaning. I fell, Abigail agreed softly, when you pushed me against the fireplace mantel, because dinner was cold when you came home 3 hours late. The sheriff's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes sharpened. He studied Thomas with renewed attention. Mr. Ross, how did you track your wife to Breckenridge? Thomas hesitated, caught off guard by the change in subject. I followed reports of a young woman traveling alone with an infant. It wasn't easy, but eventually the trail led here. Interesting, Miller remarked mildly. Because according to my deputy, you arrived on yesterday's stage from Helena, claiming you were meeting business associates here. No mention of a missing wife or child. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want to broadcast my personal troubles. It's a private matter. Private enough that you've been telling everyone at the saloon about your runaway wife, the sheriff countered dryly. Including offering $50 to anyone who could point you to her whereabouts. A flush crept up Thomas's neck. I was merely being resourceful. Sheriff Miller leaned back in his chair, regarding Thomas thoughtfully. Mr. Ross, I've been law in this town for 15 years. In that time, I've developed a nose for trouble, and you, sir, smell like trouble to me. Thomas's expression darkened. I'm a respected businessman from St. Louis. You have no right to speak to me this way. In Breckenridge, respect is earned, not assumed, Miller replied evenly. And in my experience, men who hurt women aren't worthy of much respect at all. This is outrageous, Thomas sputtered. My wife and child are my property by law. You have no authority to keep them from me. The sheriff's eyes hardened. I have the authority to keep the peace in my town. And something tells me that peace would be sorely tested if you were to regain custody of Mrs. Ross and her child. He turned to Abigail. Madam, do you wish to return with your husband? No, Sheriff. Abigail answered without hesitation. I do not. Miller nodded as if confirming something to himself. Mr. Keller, you've been providing shelter for Mrs. Ross and her son? Yes, sir, Daniel confirmed, for several months now, and you're willing to continue doing so. Daniel's gaze briefly met Abigail's. For as long as they wish to stay. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. This is absurd. You can't simply ignore the law because you don't like me, Sheriff. I have rights. Indeed you do, Miller agreed calmly. And Mrs. Ross has the right not to be beaten by her husband. The child has the right to grow up without fearing his father's fists. He rose as well, his stance casual but authoritative. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Ross. You're going to leave on tomorrow morning's stage. You're not going to approach Mrs. Ross or attempt to locate her son. If you do, I'll have you in my jail so fast your head will spin. Thomas's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. I'll go over your head. I'll write to the territorial governor. Feel free, the sheriff invited, seemingly unperturbed by the threat. In the meantime, I suggest you return to the hotel and pack your things. He moved toward the door, opening it in clear dismissal. Deputy Barnes will escort you to ensure you don't get lost. The deputy, a young man with a serious expression, stepped forward from his position by the wall. This way, Mr. Ross. For a moment, it seemed Thomas might resist. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his eyes blazed with fury as he glared at Abigail. This isn't over, he promised, his voice low and menacing. Not by a long shot. That sounded remarkably like a threat, Mr. Ross, Sheriff Miller observed mildly. Care to rephrase? Thomas's jaw worked as he visibly struggled to control his temper. I'll be back, he said finally. With the law on my side. With that, he stormed out, followed closely by Deputy Barnes. When the door closed behind them, Abigail sagged in her chair, the tension of the confrontation leaving her suddenly exhausted. Thank you, Sheriff, she said quietly, but he's right about the law. As his wife, I have no legal standing to refuse his demands. Sheriff Miller resumed his seat, his expression thoughtful. Law's a funny thing, Mrs. Ross. What's written in books back east doesn't always align with what's right out here on the frontier. He glanced at Daniel. Mr. Keller, I believe you mentioned your intention to continue providing for Mrs. Ross and her child. Daniel nodded, his brow furrowed in confusion. Yes, of course. The sheriff pulled a sheet of paper from his desk drawer along with a pen and inkwell. In that case, I think it might be prudent for you and Mrs. Ross to formalize your arrangement. He began writing, his script neat and deliberate. A marriage license, to be specific, Abigail gasped, but I'm already married. Legally, I can't legally, Miller interrupted gently. You've been abandoned by your husband. A not uncommon occurrence out here where men often leave to seek their fortunes elsewhere, never to return. He continued writing, not looking up. Should anyone inquire, you believed your first husband dead, a reasonable assumption given his extended absence and lack of communication. Your subsequent marriage to Mr. Keller was undertaken in good faith. Daniel and Abigail exchanged stunned glances. Sheriff, Daniel began carefully, are you suggesting we commit fraud? Miller looked up, his expression serious. I'm suggesting you protect a woman and child from a man who would harm them. The law is meant to serve justice, Mr. Keller. Sometimes that requires creative interpretation. He pushed the partially completed form across the desk. Of course, this is merely a suggestion. The decision is yours. Abigail stared at the paper, her thoughts racing. What the sheriff was proposing was technically illegal, yet it offered a solution she had thought impossible: legal protection from Thomas through a new marriage. She turned to Daniel, uncertain how he would react to such a proposition. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Abigail, he said quietly, may I speak with you outside for a moment? She nodded, following him to the small porch that fronted the sheriff's office. The street beyond was busy with afternoon activity, townspeople going about their business, unaware of the life-altering decision being contemplated just feet away. Daniel turned to face her, his expression grave. Abigail, I want you to know that you're under no obligation here. What the sheriff is suggesting, it's a serious step, one with permanent implications. I know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. If we do this, he continued, it would be a real marriage in the eyes of the law and the community, not just a convenient arrangement. Abigail searched his face. Is that what you want, a real marriage? Daniel's composure faltered slightly, revealing a vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed. What I want, he said carefully, is for you and Joshua to be safe and happy. If that means a marriage of convenience, I'll accept those terms, but he hesitated, then plunged ahead, but I won't pretend it's what I hope for. What do you hope for? Abigail asked, her heart pounding. Daniel took her hands in his touch gentle yet firm. I hope for a true partnership. A marriage based on mutual respect and affection. His eyes met hers, honest and direct. I care for you, Abigail, more than I ever expected to care for anyone again, and I love that boy of yours like he was my own flesh and blood. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes. Daniel, let me finish, he requested softly. I'm not Thomas. I don't expect ownership or obedience. What I want is a companion, someone to share my life with, someone who chooses to be with me, not because she needs protection, but because she wants to build something together. He squeezed her hands lightly. I won't rush you. If you need time to consider, I don't, Abigail interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. I don't need time. Daniel's expression remained guarded, as if afraid to hope. You're sure? In answer, Abigail rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but heartfelt, a promise of feelings that had been growing quietly between them for months. When she pulled back, Daniel's eyes were wide with wonder. Is that a yes? He asked, a smile beginning to tug at the corners of his mouth. Abigail nodded, her own smile tremulous but genuine. Yes, Daniel Keller, I will marry you not just for protection, but because you've shown me what it means to be truly cared for, what it means to be respected. She touched his cheek lightly, what it means to be loved. Daniel's smile bloomed fully, transforming his face with joy. I do love you, Abigail Ross, you and Joshua both. They returned to the sheriff's office hand in hand, their decision made. Miller looked up as they entered, his expression knowing. I take it we're proceeding with the paperwork, Daniel nodded, his thumb stroking the back of Abigail's hand. Yes, Sheriff, if you'll have us. Miller grinned, revealing a glimpse of the younger man beneath the weathered exterior. Been performing marriages since I took office. Comes with the badge out here. He gestured for them to sit, dipping his pen in the inkwell. Just need a few details to make it official. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Sheriff Miller led them through the traditional vows, his voice carrying a dignity that belied the unorthodox circumstances. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Abigail with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of unexpected joy. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Keller, Miller said, handing them the completed marriage certificate. I suggest you keep this somewhere safe, and perhaps let a few key members of the community know about your recent nuptials. The more people who can attest to your marriage, the better. Daniel tucked the certificate carefully into his coat pocket. We understand, Sheriff, and thank you for everything. Miller waved away his gratitude. Just doing my job, seeing justice done. His expression turned serious again. That said, I'd advise caution in the coming weeks. Men like Ross don't give up easily. Keep your eyes open and maybe have a friend or two stay at the ranch for a spell, just until we're sure he's truly gone. The warning cast a shadow over their newfound happiness, but Daniel nodded gravely. We'll be careful. As they left the sheriff's office, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. They were married, legally bound in a union that had begun as a strategy for protection, but had somehow, against all odds, blossomed into something genuine. Mrs. Keller, Daniel said softly as they walked toward the livery stable, testing the sound of her new name. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Abigail smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years despite the threat that still loomed. It does indeed, Mr. Keller, it does indeed. The news of Daniel and Abigail's marriage spread quickly through Breckenridge and the surrounding homesteads. The story took on a romantic gloss in the retelling the lonely rancher who found a pregnant woman in a storm and offered her shelter, only to fall in love with both mother and child. It was the kind of tale frontier communities savored, a reminder that even in the harsh realities of their existence, love could flourish. Thomas Ross, as Sheriff Miller had predicted, did not take his defeat gracefully. He refused to leave on the morning stage, instead taking a room at the hotel for an extended stay and making inquiries about legal representation in Helena. His presence cast a pall over Daniel and Abigail's newly formalized union, a constant reminder that their happiness remained precarious. "He can't touch us now," Daniel reassured Abigail as they collected Joshua from Mrs. Simmons. "Not legally. You're my wife in the eyes of the law and the community." Abigail nodded, but the fear that had been her constant companion for so long was not easily banished. "What if he challenges the marriage, claims it's fraudulent?" "Let him try," Daniel said with quiet confidence. "We have the sheriff's backing and the support of our neighbors. Out here, that counts for more than any legal technicality." His certainty helped ease Abigail's anxiety, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas would not surrender so easily. He had always been possessive, viewing her as property rather than a partner. The fact that she had not only escaped, but found happiness with another man would rankle his pride beyond endurance. Their return to the Double K Ranch was marked by a strange mixture of jubilation and tension. The cabin that had been Abigail's temporary refuge was now officially her home, Daniel's bed their shared domain. The transition should have been awkward, given the unusual circumstances of their union, but instead felt natural, the culmination of months of growing closeness. That evening, after Joshua had been fed and put to bed in his cradle, Daniel and Abigail sat by the fire, the reality of their new situation settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, breaking the companionable silence. "We should make it official in the church, too, when Reverend Hayes comes through next month. A proper ceremony with witnesses and maybe even a celebration afterward." Abigail looked up from her mending, touched by his consideration. "You wouldn't mind going through it all again?" Daniel smiled, the firelight playing across his features. "I'd marry you 100 times over, Abigail Keller, in every church and courthouse from here to the Atlantic." He reached across to take her hand. "Besides, it would put to rest any lingering doubts about the legitimacy of our union." She turned her hand in his, entwining their fingers. "I'd like that," she admitted. "A real wedding with friends to share in it." "Then it's settled," Daniel declared, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "1 month from now, you'll become my wife, again." The tenderness of the gesture, coupled with the promise in his words, sent a warm flush through Abigail. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully embrace the possibility of a future with this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect since the moment they met. That night, as they prepared for bed, there was a moment of uncertainty, a brief, awkward pause as they contemplated the physical aspect of their marriage that had, until now, remained unaddressed. Daniel, ever sensitive to Abigail's feelings, made no demands, offering instead to continue his vigil by the fireplace if she preferred. "This is all very sudden," he acknowledged, his voice gentle. "I understand if you need time." Abigail studied him in the soft glow of the lamp, this man who had given her shelter when she had nothing, who had delivered her son with capable hands, who had married her to protect her from a past she couldn't escape. In his eyes, she saw not expectation or entitlement, but a question, a willingness to wait until she was ready. "I don't need time," she said, echoing her words from earlier that day. "I need you, Daniel. I need the kind of love you've shown me, patient and respectful and true." The smile that illuminated his face was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. That night, in the quiet darkness of the cabin, with Joshua sleeping peacefully nearby, Abigail learned what it meant to be truly cherished by a man who saw her as an equal partner, not a possession. Daniel's touch was gentle, his consideration for her pleasure evident in every caress. When they came together as husband and wife, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to Abigail's eyes, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this was what love was meant to be. Afterward, cradled in the protective circle of his arms, Abigail felt a sense of peace she had thought lost forever. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. Daniel's arms tightened around her. "For what?" "For finding me in the rain, for giving us shelter and rest." She turned in his embrace to face him. for showing me that not all men are like Thomas." Daniel brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression solemn in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "What happened to you wasn't right, Abigail. No woman deserves to be treated that way. No child should grow up fearing his father." His voice roughened with emotion. "I swear to you, on everything I hold dear, that you'll never know that kind of fear in our home." The vehemence of his promise touched something deep within Abigail's heart. She had spent so long guarding herself against hurt that the prospect of true safety, of unconditional love, seemed almost too precious to believe. "I know," she whispered, pressing her palm to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. "I trust you, Daniel. With my life and with Joshua's." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Abigail. The routine of ranch life continued: animals to tend, meals to prepare, a household to maintain, but everything was transformed by the knowledge that this was now truly her home, Daniel truly her husband. They worked side by side, their partnership extending beyond the domestic sphere as Daniel began teaching Abigail about the operations of the ranch. "You have a good eye for cattle," he remarked one afternoon as they rode the boundaries of the property, checking on the herd. Joshua was securely strapped to Abigail's chest in a sling she had fashioned, his bright eyes taking in the unfamiliar sights with apparent fascination. Abigail laughed. "I grew up in the city. Until I met you, the closest I'd come to a cow was the milk delivered to our doorstep." "Could have fooled me," Daniel said, his expression warm with approval. "You've taken to ranch life like you were born to it." The compliment pleased her more than she cared to admit. There had been a time when Abigail had worried she might never find her place in the world again, that she would forever be running, forever looking over her shoulder. Now, astride a gentle mare with her son against her heart and her husband beside her, she felt not just safe but purposeful. But the shadow of Thomas's presence in town continued to loom over their happiness. Daniel insisted on accompanying Abigail whenever she needed to go to Breckenridge, and friends from neighboring homesteads made a point of stopping by the Double K more frequently than usual, often staying to help with chores or share a meal, a subtle but effective show of community support. It was during one such visit, nearly 2 weeks after their marriage, that news arrived which shattered their fragile peace. Ted Simmons rode up to the cabin just as dusk was falling, his expression grave as he dismounted. Daniel met him on the porch, the two men speaking in low voices that didn't carry to where Abigail sat inside, nursing Joshua by the fire. When Daniel returned, his face was tight with barely contained anger. "What is it?" Abigail asked, immediately alert to his distress. "What's happened?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of deep agitation. "Thomas Ross has been asking questions about the ranch, how to find it, how many people live here, and he's been drinking heavily, making threats." Fear, cold and familiar, slithered down Abigail's spine. "What kind of threats?" "The kind Sheriff Miller can't ignore," Daniel replied grimly. "He's been talking openly about reclaiming what's his by force if necessary. Apparently he's got himself a gun, an expensive revolver he's been showing off at the saloon." Abigail clutched Joshua closer. "He wouldn't. He's all talk, Daniel, he always was." But even as she said it, she remembered the times Thomas's anger had exploded into violence, the way his handsome face could transform into something unrecognizable with rage. She had seen what he was capable of, had borne the bruises to prove it. Daniel knelt beside her chair, his hands gentle as they covered hers. "I won't let him hurt you, Abigail, either of you, but we need to be prepared." "Prepared how?" she asked, her voice small. "Sheriff Miller is keeping an eye on him, but he can't arrest a man for talking, no matter how troubling the talk might be." Daniel's expression was resolute. "Ted and some of the other ranchers have offered to take turns staying here until Ross leaves the territory. And I think, for a while at least, you and Joshua should remain close to the house." The precautions were sensible, but they made the threat feel more real, more imminent. Abigail nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Whatever you think is best." Daniel's gaze softened as he looked at her. "What I think is that you're the strongest woman I've ever known. We'll get through this, Abigail, together." His faith in them was a balm to her frayed nerves. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Abigail found herself praying for the first time in years not for herself, but for Daniel, for the goodness in him that refused to be dimmed by the ugliness they were facing. For 3 days, they lived under the shadow of Thomas's threats. Ted Simmons, or one of the other neighboring ranchers, was always present, taking turns keeping watch. Daniel moved through his daily tasks with a new vigilance, his rifle never far from reach. Abigail tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Joshua's sake, but her nerves were stretched taut, every unexpected sound making her flinch. On the 4th day, the tension broke in a way none of them had anticipated. It was mid-afternoon, and Abigail was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, Joshua napping peacefully in his cradle inside. Daniel and Ted were checking a section of fence that had been damaged during a recent thunderstorm, not far from the house but out of sight beyond a small rise. The day was pleasantly warm, the sky a clear, untroubled blue. Abigail was reaching for another piece of damp clothing when a sound made her pause, the unmistakable rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun as she peered down the long drive that led to the main road. A single rider was approaching, moving at a steady trot. As he drew closer, Abigail's blood turned to ice in her veins. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Thomas's distinctive posture in the saddle, the flash of his white shirt against the dark coat he favored. For a moment, Abigail stood frozen, indecision paralyzing her. Should she run to fetch Daniel, lock herself in the cabin, confront Thomas alone? Before she could decide, Thomas had reached the yard, pulling his horse to a stop just yards from where she stood. He dismounted with the fluid grace that had once charmed her, adjusting his hat as he approached. "Hello, Abigail," he said, as if they were meeting for tea rather than a confrontation that had been brewing for weeks. "You're looking well. Country living seems to agree with you." Abigail backed away, putting the clothesline between them. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Is that any way to greet your husband? I've come to take you home, of course." "I am home," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And you are not my husband anymore. I'm married to Daniel Keller now." Thomas's smile tightened. "Yes, I've heard all about your arrangement with the rancher. Very clever, my dear, but we both know it's not legal. You can't marry another man while you're still married to me." "Sheriff Miller seems to think otherwise," Abigail countered, edging toward the cabin. If she could just get inside, lock the door. Thomas moved to block her path, his manner still outwardly cordial but with a dangerous undercurrent that raised the hair on the back of Abigail's neck. "The sheriff is overstepping his authority, but I'm willing to be reasonable, Abigail. Come home with me now, bring my son, and I'll forget this unfortunate episode. We can start fresh." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. "Start fresh, after you beat me, after you threatened our unborn child." She shook her head. "I'm never going back to that life, Thomas, never." His facade of civility cracked, revealing the anger simmering beneath. "You don't have a choice," he snarled, reaching for her arm. "You're my wife, and that boy is my son. I'll not have my name dragged through the mud while you play house with some dirt-poor rancher." Abigail twisted away from his grasp, her own anger flaring to meet his. "Daniel Keller is worth 10 of you, Thomas Ross. He's kind and honest and decent, everything you pretend to be but aren't." Thomas's face darkened with rage. "You ungrateful whore," he hissed, lunging for her again. "After everything I gave you, the only thing you gave her was pain." Daniel's voice cut through the air, steady and cold as steel. "And that ends now." Thomas whirled to find Daniel standing at the corner of the cabin, rifle held not quite aimed at him but ready to be raised in an instant. Ted Simmons flanked him, similarly armed. "This doesn't concern you, Keller," Thomas snapped, though he took a step away from Abigail. "This is between me and my wife." "My wife," Daniel corrected, moving to stand beside Abigail. "And it very much concerns me when a man trespasses on my property and threatens my family." Thomas laughed, the sound brittle with barely contained fury. "Family? You've known her what, a few months? You have no idea who she really is, what she's capable of." "I know everything I need to know," Daniel replied evenly. Now you have two choices, Ross. You can get back on that horse and ride away, never to return, or you can try to take what isn't yours anymore and see how that works out for you." The threat was implicit but clear. Thomas's hand twitched toward his coat, where the bulge of his new revolver was visible. "I wouldn't," Ted advised quietly. "Daniel was the best shot in the regiment during the war, could pick off a man at 500 yards, and that was before he had something worth protecting." Uncertainty flickered across Thomas's face, quickly masked by bravado. "You can't watch her every minute of every day, Keller. Sooner or later, I'll get what's mine." "No, you won't," Abigail stated, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Daniel, "because I was never yours to begin with." "Not really. A piece of paper doesn't make a marriage, Thomas. Respect does, trust does, love does." She gestured toward the cabin, where Joshua's cradle stood beside the bed she now shared with Daniel. "This is my home now, these are my people. And if you ever come near us again, I'll shoot you myself." The conviction in her voice seemed to finally penetrate Thomas's arrogance. He looked from Abigail to Daniel to Ted, calculating his odds and finding them unfavorable. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," Daniel countered. "It's been over since the day you laid a hand on her in anger, you just haven't accepted it yet." Thomas glared at them for a long moment before turning abruptly and stalking back to his horse. As he mounted, he cast one final, venomous look at Abigail. "You'll regret this," he promised, "both of you." Then he was gone, spurring his horse into a gallop down the drive, a cloud of dust the only evidence of his visit. The three of them stood in silence until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Then Abigail's legs gave way, and she would have fallen if Daniel hadn't caught her, his arms strong and secure around her waist. "It's all right," he murmured, pressing his lips to her temple. "It's over, you're safe, but for how long?" Abigail whispered, trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. "He'll be back, Daniel, you know he will." Daniel exchanged a glance with Ted, a silent communication passing between the men. "I don't think so," he said, his voice gentle but confident. "Not after today." Something in his tone made Abigail pull back to study his face. "What aren't you telling me?" Daniel sighed, guiding her toward the cabin porch where they could sit. "Sheriff Miller rode out early this morning to warn us that Ross had been asking specific questions about the ranch. By the time he got here, Ted and I had already spotted Ross scouting the property line." "You knew he was coming?" Abigail asked, bewildered. Daniel nodded grimly. "We've been expecting it, that's why we set a trap." "A trap," Ted picked up the explanation. "We made sure he overheard that Daniel and I would be working on the north pasture fence all day. Made it sound like you'd be alone with the baby. You used me as bait." Abigail wasn't sure whether to be angry or impressed. "Never," Daniel assured her quickly. "We were watching the whole time, ready to intervene if he made one wrong move. But we needed to catch him in the act of trespassing and threatening you. Now we have witnesses, not just my word against his." Understanding dawned. "Evidence. You were building a case against him." "Sheriff Miller is waiting in town," Ted confirmed. "With any luck, Ross will ride straight back to Breckenridge, still hot with anger. The sheriff will be ready." "Ready for what?" Abigail pressed. Daniel took her hand, his expression grave but satisfied. "To arrest him for trespassing, making threats, and attempting to interfere with a legal marriage. Miller said he could hold him for at least 30 days on those charges, long enough for the circuit judge to arrive. And then," Abigail hardly dared hope. "And then," Daniel said, his voice softening, "we present our case. Your testimony about the abuse, our marriage certificate, the support of the community. The judge can grant an official dissolution of your first marriage on grounds of cruelty and abandonment, confirming the legality of our union." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It won't be easy, Abigail. You'll have to speak about what happened in front of witnesses. But when it's done, Thomas Ross will have no legal claim to you or to Joshua. Not ever again." The prospect was daunting, exposing the painful details of her first marriage to public scrutiny, facing Thomas in a courtroom. But the potential reward, freedom, true, undisputed freedom from the man who had haunted her steps for so long. "I'll do it," Abigail declared, straightening her spine. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Daniel's expression filled with pride. "I never doubted you would." Ted, sensing the private nature of the moment, excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Daniel and Abigail alone on the porch. The tension of Thomas's visit gradually dissipated, replaced by a tentative hope for what the future might hold. "I meant what I said," Abigail told Daniel as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. "About this being my home, about you being my people." Daniel's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I know you did, and I meant what I said too that first night in the rain. You'll always have shelter and rest here, Abigail, always." The promise settled around her like a warm blanket, secure and comforting, for the first time since she had fled St. Louis. Abigail felt truly at peace, as if the long journey that had begun in fear and desperation had finally led her where she was meant to be. Inside the cabin, Joshua began to cry, his hungry wails carrying through the open window. Abigail rose, Daniel beside her, both of them moving instinctively toward the sound of their son, for that was how Daniel thought of him now, and how Abigail wanted him to be known. As they stepped through the doorway together, the setting sun cast long, golden rays across the threshold, illuminating the simple interior that had become their sanctuary. In that moment of perfect light, with the man she had come to love beside her and the child they would raise together waiting within, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that the storm had finally passed. The legal proceedings unfolded much as Daniel had predicted. Thomas was arrested upon his return to Breckenridge, his fury at being outsmarted only compounding his troubles as he resisted the sheriff's authority. By the time the circuit judge arrived 3 weeks later, Thomas Ross had become a pariah in the community, his true nature revealed through his own actions. The hearing was held in the town's small church, the only building large enough to accommodate the number of people who wished to attend. Abigail testified with quiet dignity about her first marriage, the abuse she had suffered, and her flight to protect her unborn child. Daniel spoke of finding her in the rain, of the months they had shared as she recovered and Joshua was born, of the love that had grown between them. Friends and neighbors stepped forward to attest to the legitimacy of their union and their standing in the community. Thomas, for his part, blustered and denied, but his credibility had been irreparably damaged by his behavior during his stay in Breckenridge. When the judge delivered his ruling, an official dissolution of Abigail's first marriage on grounds of cruelty, and a confirmation of the legality of her marriage to Daniel, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the assembled townspeople. "Furthermore," the judge added, silencing the crowd with a raised hand, "I am issuing a decree that Thomas Ross is to leave Montana Territory within 3 days and is not to approach, contact, or in any way interfere with Mrs. Abigail Keller or her son, Joshua Keller, under penalty of imprisonment." The finality of the judgment left Thomas ashen-faced and silent, his previous bravado deflated by the unequivocal rejection of his claims. Under the watchful eye of Sheriff Miller, he departed on the next eastbound stage, the last Abigail would ever see of the man who had once held such power over her life. With the shadow of Thomas permanently removed, Abigail and Daniel were free to truly begin their life together. The promised church wedding took place the following Sunday, a joyous affair that bore little resemblance to the quiet ceremony in the sheriff's office. Abigail wore a new dress of soft blue calico, with Joshua in her arms and Daniel at her side, as Reverend Hayes blessed their union before the entire community. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with neighbors contributing food and music and good wishes. Daniel had never been one for large gatherings, but that day he moved among their guests with easy confidence, his pride in his family evident in every introduction, every shared joke, every tender glance at his wife and son. Happy. He asked Abigail as they finally returned to the ranch, the wagon loaded with gifts from their friends. Abigail, drowsy with contentment and the unaccustomed excitement, leaned her head against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted, and it was true. The happiness that had seemed so elusive, so impossible during those dark days with Thomas, now surrounded her like the clear Montana air, clean and bright and sustaining. The years that followed brought challenges, as all years do, but none that they could not face together. The Double K Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, growing from a modest homestead to one of the more successful operations in the valley. Joshua thrived, developing into a sturdy, kind-hearted boy with his mother's dark hair and his adoptive father's steady nature. He was joined, 2 years after the wedding, by a sister Emma, named for Daniel's mother. She arrived on a clear winter morning, with Daniel once again serving as midwife, though this time with far less trepidation and considerably more confidence. "She's perfect," he declared, placing the squalling infant on Abigail's chest, just like her mother. Abigail, exhausted but radiant, traced a finger along the baby's downy cheek. "She has your eyes, I think." Daniel leaned in to examine his daughter's scrunched face. "Maybe. Though right now she mostly looks like a very angry little rosebud." Abigail laughed, the sound full and unrestrained, a far cry from the tentative, rusty chuckle of their early days together. "She comes by that honestly. You should see yourself when the cattle break through a fence." Daniel pretended offense, but his eyes danced with joy as he settled beside them on the bed, one arm cradling Abigail while the other gently supported their daughter. 2 more children followed over the years. Robert, who arrived with Daniel's coloring and Abigail's quick mind, and Sarah, the youngest, whose determined spirit and boundless energy kept them all on their toes. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Daniel adding rooms as needed, until the original structure was barely recognizable within the comfortable, sprawling home they had created together. Joshua, though aware from an early age that Daniel was not his biological father, never showed any interest in learning about Thomas. To him, family was defined not by blood but by love and presence by the man who had taught him to ride and rope and respect the land, who had held him through childhood fevers, and celebrated his achievements with unwavering pride. "Papa," he asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, "how did you and Mama meet?" Daniel glanced through the window to where Abigail was putting the younger children to bed, her profile softened by the lamplight. "I found her wandering in the rain," he said, the memory still vivid after more than a decade. "She was carrying you, though you weren't born yet." Joshua, now 12 and beginning to develop the lanky build that suggested he would one day match Daniel's height, considered this with thoughtful eyes. "Was she lost?" In a way, Daniel acknowledged. "She was looking for a safe place for both of you." "And you gave it to her," Joshua concluded. Daniel smiled, ruffling his son's dark hair. "I tried. I told her you'll have shelter and rest here. Turns out she gave the same to me. I was lonely before you two came along, though I didn't fully realize it at the time." Joshua leaned against the porch railing, his young face serious. "I'm glad you found her, Papa. I'm glad you're my father." The simple declaration tightened Daniel's throat with emotion. "So am I, son," he managed, pulling the boy into a brief, fierce hug. "More than you can possibly know." Inside, Abigail had finished the bedtime rituals and stood watching them through the window, her heart full to bursting with gratitude for the life they had built together. The frightened woman who had stumbled through the rain that stormy evening seemed like someone from another lifetime, a ghost laid to rest by years of safety and love. She joined them on the porch, slipping her hand into Daniel's as she settled beside him. "What are my 2 favorite men discussing so seriously?" she asked, noting their thoughtful expressions. "How we became a family," Joshua answered before Daniel could speak. "How Papa found you in the rain." Abigail smiled, the memory no longer painful but precious, the beginning of everything good in her life. "He did," she confirmed softly, "and he kept his promise. We've had shelter and rest ever since." Daniel lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm with the same reverence he had shown on their wedding day. "And we always will," he promised, his voice low and certain, "for all the days to come." As night settled over the Montana landscape, wrapping the ranch in a blanket of stars, the Keller family remained on the porch, bound together by a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, but had grown stronger with each passing season, a love built on respect, on trust, on the daily choice to cherish what they had found in one another. For Abigail, who had once known only the shadow side of marriage, this was the greatest miracle of all. That from the darkness of her past had emerged a life filled with light, with the kind of love she had almost stopped believing existed. Daniel had offered her shelter in a storm, yes, but what they had created together was so much more: a home, a family, a future unburdened by fear. And as she sat between the man who had saved her and the son they had raised together, watching the moon rise over the mountains that had become her beloved landscape, Abigail knew with unshakable certainty that this moment, this life, these people was exactly where she was meant to be.